Yes, sir. I've started recording.
Good. Dr. Prashanti has joined us already. I
Yes,
think
sir.
I could see that. Yeah,
Yes,
I
sir.
saw her name.
Ma'am is there.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
sir. Ma'am has joined, sir.
Good. Chandan, thank you.
Yes, sir. Chandan sir has been really helpful to us for the past.
Yeah,
2 days.
Chandan, thank you for being there.
Has been really helping us a lot to set up.
Yeah, for all the webinars, correct.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We checked it yesterday. We did a dry run yesterday night, and even today morning we did a dry run. And Chandan sir was really helpful to make sure everything is smooth.
Oh, good. Good. When you are ready, you let me know. You start, and then we will formally welcome everybody.
Okay, so Chandan sir, Prashanti ma'am will start it. Prashanti ma'am will begin.
And sir, Prashanti ma'am was on Facebook, I think.
Okay.
You couldn't mute everybody, sir.
Okay. So, okay. So, before starting the webinar presentation, I request everyone to remain muted throughout the entire session. We have an eminent speaker amongst us today, so I humbly request everyone to maintain decorum throughout the session. If you have any questions to ask, please write it down in the chat box. It will be read out by the host, okay, after the presentation to the speaker. Sir, can I begin the presentation, sir? Sir, I begin the presentation, sir?
Who? Yes.
Yes, sir. Can I begin the presentation, sir?
Yeah, you can.
Okay.
If Professor is ready, we will start.
Okay.
Good.
I now cordially welcome all the participants to today's webinar presentation on COVID-19, understanding its epidemiology. I would like to first welcome our beloved principal of Indian Academy Degree College, Autonomous, Dr. E. Jerome Xavier, our pillar of support and encouragement for today's webinar. Next, I would like to heartily welcome the honorable speaker of today's webinar, Professor Gautam I Menon, Professor of Biology and Physics at Ashoka University, New Delhi. I welcome all the faculty members of Indian Academy Degree College, Autonomous,
Yes, Chandan.
the student participants and participants of other institutions. The entire world today has been plagued by the shock of novel coronavirus disease 2019, abbreviated as COVID-19. The virus originated in Wuhan, China, and has today become a pandemic. In India alone, we have about 49,525 cases with actively infected people, 26,675 people who have recovered from the disease, and about 2,564 deaths due to COVID-19. In order to contain the spread of COVID-19, the governments of all the countries across the globe have initiated several lockdown programs, suspending all business, administrative, educational, and industrial activities, and encouraging all of the employees to have work from home measures. One of the major impacts of the lockdown is the loss of jobs for many daily wage workers and the employees of small scale and large scale industries. All these impacts have brought down the economy of the entire nation to a halt. So, therefore, it is very much necessary to exercise appropriate precautionary measures of protection against COVID-19. In this direction, with the sponsorship of Deputy Star College Grant, the Department of Biochemistry, Indian Academy Degree College Autonomous, has initiated today's webinar on the epidemiology of COVID-19, which will be addressed by a veteran scientist having a vast knowledge of epidemiology, Professor Gautam. Now I request our beloved principal of IADC, Dr. Jerome Xavier, to share a few words about today's webinar. Sir?
Anand sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Anand sir,
Yes,
I think Chandan is asking you to do something.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, Chandan, sir.
Somebody's turned on mic actually. Can you check before we start, sir?
Who is this Asha? One Miss
Asha, somebody in the name called Asha actually.
Yes, Principal, there is one person, Prajwal Rao. I request you to kindly mute your mic.
And please check Asha also, sir.
Yeah, she has muted.
Yes.
Okay, now it's clear.
Yes, now it's clear. Okay.
Sir, could you please say a few
Yeah,
words
I'll
about-
just say a few words.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Dear participants, mostly I could see them as academicians and a number of postgraduate students. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to each one of you on behalf of Indian Academy Degree College Autonomous Bangalore. The technology has brought us all together to a smaller world. Although our resource person, Professor Gautam Menon, is far away, it looks he's just next to us and going to share with us his rich experience and knowledge. We are truly delighted to have such an experienced, outstanding scientist, both in the Department of Physics and Biology, which is not quite easy. We know that physics is one of the toughest subject for students, but these days, since interdisciplinary approach is very important, Professor Gautam is such an example who could blend physics and biology. And as all of us are in the pandemic influence, we keep hearing so many messages, receiving informations, and sometimes we wonder which is correct and which is not correct. At times we are even panicky about these kind of things. And in this context, I'm very glad Dr. Prashanti was able to contact Professor Gautam Menon and was able to accept his consent to speak to all of us, the audience, academicians and students, research scholars, and share his personal experience and knowledge in an in-depth manner, particularly specific to COVID-19, understanding it, epidemiology. That is very important. And on behalf of the institution, once again, I extend a very warm welcome to our professor.
Thank you.
I'm so grateful, and I'm sure the audience will have fantastic information and knowledge through your 1 hour of sharing. Hearty welcome, sir. And
Thank
my
you.
dear participants, have a good time. Listen to the resource person carefully so that we will be able to draw a little bit of information and knowledge which is very genuine, authentic, and so on. Thank you. Have a pleasant evening.
Thank you, sir, for your kind words of encouragement. So before the start of the webinar, thank you so much, sir. I now take pleasure in introducing the speaker of today's webinar, Professor Gautam I Menon. Professor Gautam finished his PhD from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, in the year 1994. He pursued his postdoctoral research at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai, during the period 1994 to 1996, and also did his postdoctoral research at Simon Fraser University, Vancouver, Canada, during the period 1996 to 1998. He was a professor with theoretical physics and computational biology groups at Institute of Mathematical Sciences, Chennai, where he was the founding dean of the computational biology group. He is currently an adjunct professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai, as well as professor at the Department of Physics and Biology at Ashoka University, New Delhi. Professor Gautam has more than 80 publications in the areas of both physics as well as biophysics. He has written several articles at the interface of science and society, as well as on science policy, which is very essential today. Professor Gautam's research interests are the epidemiology of diseases, which is very much of relevance today during the pandemic. So I kindly request Professor Gautam Menon to take over the podium and kindly begin the webinar. Thank you, sir. So before starting, I would request everybody to kindly mute your microphones as well as your video. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Xavier. Thank you, Dr. Anantakrishna. Can you hear me clearly? I will just begin to share my screen. Can you see my screen clearly?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, doctor, we can see.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So let me start by thanking the Indian Academy for your very kind invitation to speak here. And I want to tell you a little bit about what we understand about COVID-19 epidemiology and some models for that epidemiology that we have just begun to implement in India, so that we have a better understanding of the Indian situation with regard to this disease. Let me start with the fact that this is a disease called COVID-19. It's caused by a virus. This type of virus is called a coronavirus, and we'll come to why it's called a coronavirus a little later. It was earlier called 2019 NCOV, standing for novel coronavirus, but then the WHO and its associated agencies changed its name to what is called SARS-CoV-2. SARS for severe acute respiratory syndrome, reminiscent of the disease SARS, which came about 18 years before that. In this CoV-2 is coronavirus, the second in that list of SARS-related viruses. Although the technical name of the virus is SARS-CoV-2, we all informally refer to it as a coronavirus, and I will stick by that name just for clarity as we go along. So let me distinguish between different types of outbreaks of diseases, scales of disease. An outbreak is a disease which happens in somewhat greater number than you expect normally in a community. An epidemic is an infectious disease that spans a larger region than a simple outbreak, so it spreads rapidly to many people. A pandemic is an epidemic that crosses geographical boundaries, that crosses multiple countries in the world. And that's the current state of COVID-19. It now affects around 230 different countries in the world. It's characterized by also what you could call community transmission. That is to say, you cannot isolate the original source, the person who brought the disease in, potentially from the outside anymore, because now it has spread within the community of people and is easily transferred from person to person. There are many movies that are based on the principles of an epidemic disease. There's one called Contagion. There's a Malayalam movie called Virus, which is apparently also a good movie. But you can see that even in popular culture, the idea of a disease that spreads very rapidly across multiple people, killing as it goes, is really an important component of even how we view what is popular culture nowadays. So examples of pandemics are, one example that is still with us is HIV/AIDS. The other example is an old example from about roughly 100 years ago, which is Spanish flu. The Spanish flu is a type of influenza that's related to the H1N1 influenza, and this hit the world between January 1918 and December 1919. It was called Spanish flu because it was initially associated with the country of Spain, although that isn't really where it started off as far as we historically understand. And it affected a very large number of people across the world. In fact, it infected about 500 million people at that time, which was about 25% of the world population. Between 30 and 50 million people died as a consequence of the infection by Spanish flu. And about 15 to 20 million people alone died in India, which at that time was 5 to 10% of our population. That's a very, very large number. If you imagine the 5 to 10% of a population at any point, is an extremely large number. The Spanish flu, if you look at those numbers, killed around 2.5% of its victims. And even though we don't normally think of influenza, the flu is killing such large numbers, remember that it infected a very large number of people, and medical care was much cruder then. We had no idea that antibiotics didn't exist at that point of time, so they couldn't be applied to dealing. And anyway, this was a viral disease, so antibiotics would not have worked. But people were already struggling with the aftermaths of the First World War, and 5 years to 6 years of deprivation, of trench warfare, already had sapped the immunities of a large fraction of the population, which was why it's believed that this particular epidemic killed such a large number of people. You should think of COVID-19 as really stretching through a bunch of diseases that we've even seen within this particular century, starting with SARS, which hit the world between 2002 and 2003, with H1N1 in 2009 related to Spanish flu, MERS in 2012, which you may not have heard of, but is really another disease somewhat similar to SARS-CoV-2, Ebola, which sort of started from mid-1970s, but then has periodically erupted and started again in 2013. And currently the world is still seeing Ebola cases in the western part of Africa. And then, of course, there's SARS-CoV-2 from 2019 onwards, which is the current epidemic that the world is dealing with. SARS, MERS, and COVID-19 are all caused by the same type of virus. This is called a coronavirus. And it's called a coronavirus because of the strange crown-like shape that you can see over here in that picture. All of these diseases lack treatments or vaccines currently, which is why there is no way you can have of giving a drug to a person that might help them eliminate the disease. And there's no way of vaccinating people against the disease. So any disease that can potentially kill people and has these additional attributes that is hard to deal with either pharmaceutically or through vaccines is somewhat special. Bacteria and viruses, the coronavirus is a virus, of course, but there are other diseases that are caused by bacteria, These move between humans either directly or indirectly. One way, of course, is through direct contact, for one person touching another person. The other is indirect contact. For example, you might leave, you might sneeze, your droplets might fall on a doorknob, or you might wipe your hands against your face and use it to open a door. And someone else will come by, open that same door, and then transfer that to their face by wiping the face. And the moment it enters your nasal cavity or your throat cavities, that's where the virus can begin to multiply. The other way is through droplets. So, for example, someone sneezes, they emit small little droplets into the air, and someone else can suck those droplets in, and someone else can even come in later because these are very light droplets. They take a long time to sink to the ground or otherwise dissipate. So that's another way in which you can transfer the disease from one person to another. Some types of diseases, including the coronavirus, come to us from animals, for example, from bats or poultry. These are what are called natural hosts for these viruses. And the event by which they move to human beings is called a spillover event. And usually there is some intermediate animals involved. It's not directly from, say, bats or poultry to human beings, but often there is some intermediate animal before it reaches human beings. So for MERS, for example, the intermediate animal is thought to be a camel. So the direction in which moves is from bats to camels to human beings. And SARS, MERS, and the coronavirus are all examples of viruses that we believe have their natural hosts as animal hosts, but then they move to human beings. Something changes in them that makes it possible for them to influence human beings. So let's look at a timeline of what happened in order to understand the disease a little better. On the 31st of December 2019, the World Health Organization was informed by the Chinese government of an outbreak of what was called pneumonia of unknown cause in Wuhan. Wuhan is the seventh largest city in China with about 11 million residents. So that already makes it bigger than Bangalore, where all of you are. It makes it a little smaller than Bombay or Delhi, but it's still a fairly large city. Very important because it's the center of multiple manufacturing industries, as well as multiple trade routes out of China. Already throughout parts of December, especially towards the ends of December, we had Wuhan hospitals had been seeing an increase in patients who reported with pneumonia-like illness, but it wasn't pneumonia in any normal form as we understand it. It was viral pneumonia, and that was what the eventual diagnosis was, except they couldn't figure out what was the virus that was responsible for this type of pneumonia. So patients reported with a whole bunch of symptoms, and these are also symptoms that we see in patients nowadays. A dry cough is one symptom, fever is certainly another symptom, exhaustion is a symptom that many patients reported with, shortness of breath is another characteristic symptom of COVID-19. A runny nose, pneumonia in some cases, in more extreme cases, abdominal pain and diarrhea in some cases, various forms of neurological symptoms are all symptoms that are associated with COVID-19. The interesting thing is all of these symptoms are what you might call flu-like. For example, a runny nose, a fever, a cough, etc., are all people with flus or colds have typically similar symptoms. Unfortunately, there are different families of viruses involved, so you cannot tell whether this is a flu or a coronavirus infection unless you actually do a test, do a lab test. So that's the interesting thing about this disease. It resembles the flu. It transmits easily between person to person like the flu, but you cannot tell whether it is the influenza or it is COVID-19 unless you actually have a test. So let me go to what we know now about the disease. First of all, and this is the most important thing to remember about the disease, that the majority of infections of COVID-19 are fairly mild. So most people will experience simple flu-like symptoms. They may last for a day or 2 days. There may be a little more exhaustion than involved in a normal flu, but about 81% of patients will basically think of it really as a bad cold and nothing much more than that. About 13.8%, let's say about 14%, experience severe symptoms. That is to say, these are symptoms that require hospitalization because they will have breathing difficulty, they may need to be given oxygen, their fever may rise up too high. But that's in additional, let's say about 12 to 13%. Then a further rough 5% will need hospitalization or critical care. By critical care, I mean an ICU unit or some ventilation, external ventilation provided or ECMO provided. And about 2% of all patients who are infected with the disease will wind up dying. And there's a big argument about whether that is 2% reflects the number of cases that are diagnosed with COVID-19, or whether it's actually a much smaller number who will die, because there are many, many more people who are infected than who are diagnosed cases of COVID-19. A few more things that we know about the disease, that usually the people who are most at risk are people in the elderly age bracket, those age 60 plus. So if you look at the age distribution, for example, either across Italy or UK or Russia or China, where there have been a fairly large number of cases, and there is good enough data to make epidemiological conclusions from, you will see that between the ages of about 1 year or 0 years to about let's say about 50 or 55, the probability of falling sick, or falling sick seriously, is actually very small. And the probability of dying is small, but the probability of death increases fairly rapidly as you move into the 70 or 80-year-old bracket. What adds to this is people with pre-existing conditions of any sort. For example, if you have diabetes or any form of cardiovascular disease or chronic respiratory disease, your chances of dying are correspondingly higher, even if you are younger. Even if you are aged between 40 and 50, but you had one or more of these conditions, your risk of dying would be correspondingly larger. That's another thing to remember about the disease, that it's not just age, but also what ailments you bring together with if you contract it. Interestingly, whether you're male or female is also a determining factor. In the rough division seems to be about 63% men versus 37% women is a rough difference. And we really don't know the real reasons behind why men are a little more likely to die as a consequence of COVID-19 than women are. So let me tell you a little bit about the history of COVID-19. And what is known is that many patients had some contact with the Hunan seafood wholesale market in the center of the city of Wuhan. And at least about, let's say about 40 to 50% of patients had some connection. They would go there, they would shop there, they would be shopkeepers there. So that was the first thing that attracted the attention of the Chinese health authorities when they began to think about COVID-19 and where it could have come from, that somehow the seafood market was responsible. So that's what the shuttered seafood market looked like once it was closed. This is a picture on the 21st of January. And if you looked at the timeline, the seafood market, the World Health Organization was, of course, informed on the 31st of December. The seafood market was closed on the 1st of January. The first sequence of the genome of the virus was sequenced on the 10th of January. That's actually very, very fast, come to think about it. And then the first cases, the first death in China was reported on the 11th. On the 23rd of January, Wuhan city was completely quarantined. It's one of the few examples where a whole city in modern times has been quarantined with the disease to control the spread of the disease. On the 30th of January, the World Health Organization announced what is called a PHEIC, or a FEIC, which is a public health emergency of international concern, thereby signaling to the world community that they feared that the disease would spread beyond the borders of China. On the 30th of January, India saw its first case. This was a bunch of medical students who came back from Wuhan around the middle of January and fell ill around the end of January. Okay. By the 4th of March, and many things happened in between, India tightened, especially its visitors from first from China and then from other countries affected by the disease. And by the 4th of March, India was screening compulsorily all international travelers into India. This is a picture of where we stand currently with respect to COVID-19 as of today, 14th May, 12 p.m. Currently, there are 4.4 million cases of COVID-19 across the world. Okay, that's 44 lakhs 200. That's 4 lakh 42. Yeah, 42 lakhs 29,810. The number. There's 298,174 deaths. That's about 2,98,000 deaths. We've seen about 16 lakhs of recovery, and it has now crossed 229 countries, which is pretty much every country in the world. If you look at the increase in the number of cases, you can see that plotted in the figure below. You can see that it's still continuing to increase, and we're not seeing a saturation of that particular curve. So throughout the world, if you look at the whole world itself, the number of cases of COVID-19 is actually increasing. That's over the whole world. What happens when you look at the countries inside the world, and what do they look like? So this is a plot where you plot on a darker shade as each country on the globe, depending upon the fraction of the number of confirmed cases that it has seen per million of its population. So that's it per a certain unit that it chooses. The darker scale here is more than 5,000 cases per million of the population. The lighter shades is 0 to 5 cases per million population. So some things immediately stand out when you look at this. First of all, the US stands out, the continental United States stands out. There are countries such as Ecuador and Peru on the western side of South America that stand out. Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, and the United Kingdom stand out. Sweden stands out here. Russia stands out. Iran stands out. Turkey stands out. India is a lighter shade, and so is China a lighter shade, because China has now controlled its epidemic as much as we can understand about it. And as on a sort of per capita basis, the number of cases just isn't as large as the number of cases in the UK and the US. These are the real numbers for what these cases look like. For the US, it's around 1.3 million cases as of today, May 14. Russia has seen 242,000 cases as of today. The UK, 230,000. So Russia moved from point number 3 to number 2. And then you have Brazil at 190,000. India comes about 5 or 6, maybe about 7 or 8 countries down at about 78,055 cases as of today. So you can see on this figure, the plot of how the numbers of cases in these countries has actually been increasing. If you look at India, the number of confirmed cases in India has been rising roughly linearly, and the doubling time for these has been about 10 to 14 days. And by linearly, I mean that this is a curve that goes right up to the end towards the right of the figure. And that's a straight line that I have put right on top. I have moved that line on top of those points that are over there. And the fact is that this curve, the increase in the number of cases, seems to follow that line that I have drawn over at least the last, let us say, the roughly 10 days. So this corresponds to, this particular piece of information corresponds to the total number of cases doubling somewhere between 10 and 14 days. And of course, if it takes, the longer it takes for that number of cases to double, the better it is. So now if you, if you move now to the next slide here, which is, if you look at the doubling time of total confirmed COVID-19 cases, as I said, for the United States and the United Kingdom, that number is large. It's between 30 and 35 days for those numbers to double. For India, it's somewhere between 10 and 14 days. And I bet the number probably is a little more like 14 currently. This is as of a few days, which I think 2 days ago on the 11th, we had over 10,000 new cases detected in the last 3 days, which is the highest daily incidence at 4,213 cases. It's now dipped slightly. It's harder to see what this trend might be unless you observe it over a few days. So whether we are over the peak and whether it's coming down is something that is yet to be seen. What we would like to see is the number of new cases per day going down, dropping seriously across a period of something like a week to 10 days. And then we can say that the epidemic may in some sense be under control. If you look at what is called the case fatality rate, and this is an important term that I want you to remember, this is the number of deaths divided by the number of confirmed cases. If you look at the United Kingdom or Italy, they have seen between 12 and 14% of a number. That means a much larger fraction of deaths as a function of confirmed cases. For India, the number is small. It's somewhere between around, let us say, between 2 and 3%, or 3% or 3.1%, roughly speaking. So that's interesting. Why is India seeing a relatively low case fatality rate? Why is it seeing a relatively small number of deaths per number of confirmed cases? This is not a very useful measure in a sense, because what you would really like to know is the number of deaths divided by number of people who get the infection. This is called the infection fatality rate. But we don't know that because we're not able to track the number of people who get the infection. It's easier to track the number of confirmed cases. Overall, India is testing relatively small numbers of people. If you look at the United States or the United Kingdom, you're actually looking at numbers somewhere between 15 and 25 tests per 1,000 people. For India, that number is between 1 and 2, maybe around 1.5 per 1,000 people. So it's still a very small number. In most countries, a good number of countries are doing better than us on that particular metric. Let's look at India at a more micro level. So here is where you color every state of India by the number of cases. So the darker colors here, the red color here is 30,000 cases. And you can see that the red color here really is only Maharashtra. Below that, other states which have seen a fairly large number of cases are Gujarat and the state of Tamil Nadu together. And then along with that, you can see that there are parts of Karnataka, the state where you're in, of Andhra, etc. Delhi has a large number of cases, but you don't quite see that here because it's a small region. But there's a fair amount of variation across India in terms of the number of cases that we are seeing. You can even look at state-wise numbers. So as I said, the numbers have gone up by 3,722 between yesterday and today. And most of those cases have been in Maharashtra, which has gone up by 1,495 cases. Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Delhi, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, if you look at it in order. So Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, and Delhi really account for a fairly large fraction of the total number of new cases that we are seeing. So here are the numbers for Maharashtra. Maharashtra has now about 25,922 cases. Gujarat, close to 10,000 cases, 9,200 cases. Tamil Nadu, again, 9,200 cases odd. Delhi, 7,998, almost 8,000 cases. And then Rajasthan with 4,300, Madhya Pradesh with 4,100. So you can see all of these are trending upwards, but the total number, more or less, is remaining, it's possibly slightly flattening out. You can look at the tests per million people as a function of the number of positive cases among them. Maharashtra has both testing somewhere in the middle, but also seeing a large number of positive cases. Delhi is testing many, many more people on average and seeing some fraction of larger number of positive cases for the number of tests that it does. Gujarat is also there in the upper right-hand bracket. And you can see that it's divided by a vertical line and a horizontal line. That's a national average for these. So anything above this, above the horizontal line, is above the national average in terms of the number of positive cases per test. Anything to the left of the vertical line is below average in terms of the number of tests per million people. So here is a district-wise map of everything that's going on with COVID. And you can see that the districts here, there are several districts in Maharashtra which are affected mostly. You can see which districts in Rajasthan have been affected, which districts in Tamil Nadu have been affected. There's a large region in the center of India which is relatively less affected, but we don't know whether this is also because testing is less efficient in those areas yet. Bengal is another place where we've seen increasingly large numbers of cases. But you can see that there are cases reported in about 530 odd out of the 730 odd districts of India. If you look at the few numbers that there are out of India, there's a large asymmetry by gender. In fact, it's larger than the 60-40 odd split that I showed you in the international data. It's more like 70-30 in the Indian data. The elderly again continue to be most at risk, and people with pre-existing conditions continue to be greatly at risk. I want to now tell you a little bit about models and get to this question of why we should think of modeling a disease and what is the information that we get out of models of disease. So the question of why you should model is an interesting question. The reason is that a model tells you what to expect in terms of where the disease is going. It gives you some ability to plan ahead. You can compare many different ways of dealing with the disease that don't actually relate to having a medicine or having a vaccine for the disease. These are called non-pharmaceutical interventions. A pharmaceutical intervention would be a drug or a vaccine. And then overall, models give you a better intuition for how the disease is spreading and how to cope with that increase. So first, let's ask the question of what could we ask about an epidemic? What is it that we want to know? One question certainly is, how do diseases affect populations? How do infectious diseases affect populations? And this field is a field called epidemiology, which means on top of human beings, the diseases that survive because of humans. And you can think of a curve such as the one that I've shown you as depicting a proportion with ill health, which changes with time. The simplest way of thinking about it, the most classic models for disease, are what are called compartmental models. And the simplest of these compartmental models are what are called SIR models. S stands for susceptible, I for infected, and R for recovered. So to think about this, just imagine every individual is assigned to a particular compartment, which would be susceptible, infected, or recovered. And as a susceptible person falls ill, we move them from the compartment susceptible to the compartment that is labeled infected. So just moving individuals between compartments or changing the absolute numbers within these compartments corresponds to people falling ill and then recovering or dying. So the idea that someone who is susceptible can become infected and recover is a cornerstone, except that we don't worry about individual people. All we are concerned about is the total number of susceptible, the total number of infected, the total number of recovered. And everybody in the population can be put into one or the other of these compartments with respect to specific disease. The twist here is that susceptible people need to come into contact with infected people in order to develop the infection. If I'm susceptible, I won't develop the disease out of nowhere. I have to associate in some way, physically come close to someone who's already infected. Once I'm infected, there is a natural time scale. It will take 5 days, 7 days, maybe 10 days. But I will either recover or die at the end of that particular period. So that's where the susceptible, infected, recovered together come in. And the influence of the infected on the susceptible is indicated by the dashed arrow that connects them. So this is not an arrow that depicts a flow between susceptible, infected, and recovered compartments, but an arrow that denotes an influence between compartments. The susceptible individuals need to come into contact with infected individuals in order to fall ill. And the larger the number of infected people, the easier it is for susceptible people to fall ill because it's easier to come into contact with someone who is infected. We can describe this using mathematical equations. So those are the equations that I've shown you to the right. These are very classic old equations by two physician mathematicians called Kermack and McKendrick around between 1926 and 1929, who took that simple model that I described you in words and wrote down equations for it. And then they based all of their analysis on these equations. Here's one result of what they did. So this is a fit to those equations, to the solution to those equations. And that fit is a line that is drawn through that bunch of points. The dark points that you can see there are the points that are actual victims of the plague, the number of infected with the plague who came into hospital over a 32-week period around 1906 when the plague epidemic was sweeping through Bombay. So this was Kermack and McKendrick's understanding from a theoretical model of how the plague epidemic played out in Bombay. And you can see that the fit to the real data, the underlying clinical data, the number of patients who came in per week is actually extremely good. So that's why this model and this figure and this approach is thought of as being a cornerstone of how we think about epidemiology. If you wanted to look at not just the infected people, the susceptible people and the recovered people, that's what the curve looks like. The susceptible people starts out large and then it comes down and saturates. The infected people go up and come down, and the recovered people goes up and then saturates again. So if I add the total number of susceptible, infected, and recovered at any time, this must always add up to the same number, because all I'm doing is moving people around compartments. I'm not changing the total number of people, at least in the simple model for disease. Given this, the questions are, will the disease spread? How many people will be infected? How many people could die? And all of these questions really rely on one particular quantity. It's called the basic reproductive ratio. The notation for that is R0 or R0. So let me tell you a little bit about what that is. R0 or R0, so whatever you want to call it, is the answer to the simple question, for each sick person, how many people will be infected? If I take a completely susceptible population and I put one sick person in that, on average, how many people do they manage to infect? So the numbers for a bunch of diseases are there. Ebola, it's 2, swine flu, it's 2, HIV is 4, smallpox is 7, measles is as large as 18, which means that measles spread very rapidly among a population that has not been vaccinated against the measles. Luckily, vaccination is part of every Indian child's immunization schedule as they grow up. So the chances that you will catch measles as a child is now very, very small. But this used to be a major issue with children. People used to die of this in the years before an immunization program was actually instituted. The number for the coronavirus is somewhere between 2 and 3, as best as we know. Whether it's 2.2 or 2.4 or 2.5 is still under debate. Currently, this is lower because we've just made it more difficult for people to transfer the disease from one person to the other. It's now probably somewhere around 1.5, 1.4. Our own estimate is around 1.3 at the moment for the value of what the disease, the rate at which you spread from person to person should actually be like. Here's a slightly more complicated model than the simple SIR model. And this model introduces a new compartment: the susceptible, the exposed compartment, the infected compartment, and the recovered compartment. And the compartment that you introduce for a particular disease must be specific to the understanding of that disease. And not long after we first understood what the coronavirus could do, it was understood that there was a need to have an exposed compartment, to have people who were infected with the disease could potentially transfer the disease to other people, but need not show symptoms of that particular disease. Need not have enough virus in their blood, they could be easily diagnosed, or enough symptoms that they could be diagnosed as being symptomatic for the particular disease. So the SEIR model is a model, the simplest model that one could think about for the coronavirus, for COVID-19. And as I said, these models are all called compartmental models to emphasize the fact that we think of putting people into different compartments and looking at how they move between these different compartments. The only other term that's useful here is a term called the serial interval. So I'm teaching you a little bit about epidemiology. The serial interval is the time that it takes between a primary case patient having the onset of symptoms, one person being infectious and showing symptoms for it, and infecting someone else. So this is a curve that sort of rises and peaks around somewhere between 4 and 5 days between the first person getting infected. But the interesting thing is that if you look at this, there's a little tail, you could say, towards the negative side, which means that you can infect a person before you yourself show symptoms. And that's really the asymptomatic transmission that characterizes the COVID-19. I'm now going to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we have been doing and the results that we have derived from that work. This is work called the INDSCI-SIM Model, Indian Scientist Simulation Model. This is part of a group of work that a bunch of Indian scientists, currently around 500 to 600 Indian scientists, people who work in media, people who work in graphics and science communication, writers, graphic artists, communicators at various levels, retired professors and so on, have been grouped together in order to think about how it is that we can organize the Indian response to COVID-19. So out of this, there is a group that works on the modeling of diseases, and I've been associated with that group. I want to tell you a little bit about those models, just to give you a little bit of epidemiological detail into how we think about them. So that's the website of the Indian Scientists' Response to COVID-19. I urge you to go and have a look at it. There's a lot of useful information there. Among the useful information is how to bust hoaxes. For example, suppose someone tells you that, look, I've heard that if you chop up tulsi leaves and drink that every morning for 1 week, you will never catch COVID-19. These information here is scientific information that tells you how to address that. Is that true or not? What happens with air conditioning? Does it help or not? What happens? How do I contract it? What precautions do I take to make sure that I reduce my chances of getting COVID-19? How do I self-quarantine? All of these answers are there in the Indian Scientific Response to COVID-19 page, including lots of information that you can download. That much of it is in Indian languages. There are 18 Indian languages, including Kannada, Telugu, Malayalam, Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, etc., etc. They're all over there. And the work that I will tell you is also on 2 PDF files in that particular page, which is the first work that describes the model and the second work that describes one particular strategy for getting people back to work. There's also on that web page something called a dashboard. So you can actually check our calculations by entering numbers of your own and asking, if I know that I have so many cases in Karnataka as of today, I know that this is how the disease spreads within Karnataka. And you should read the help pages first to figure out what are sensible numbers for that. Then you can figure out how the numbers of infected rises and falls as a function of time as a model prediction. So what we wanted to do was to set up a compartmental model, like the model that I told you about, the SIR model and the SEIR model, to describe COVID-19 spread in India. In fact, we wanted to start with Indian states and then move to Indian districts. We wanted to put the rates at which you move between these compartments. We wanted to make sure that they were as carefully selected as possible to represent the way disease spread, or everything that we knew about COVID-19. We want to include the fact that people could migrate from state to state. We wanted to be able to test many non-pharmaceutical interventions, test lockdowns, just testing people and quarantining them. All of these we wanted to test against each other to see what is the most efficient way of removing the disease from our population. And then, as I said, we developed an online tool, and we wanted to make this easily accessible to anyone who wanted to work with it. So the first part of it is to replace the SEIR by a much more complicated description of how the disease actually affects people. Imagine that you infect someone who's susceptible. The first step that they make is to the exposed compartment. So now they've been exposed to the disease at the point of infection. They stay within the exposed compartment for somewhere between 1 and 2 days, and then they become infectious to other people. But they can be asymptomatically infectious, which means they show no symptoms at all. They can have mild symptoms, and we start with pre-symptomatic and then move to any of these categories. So you have an intermediate pre-symptomatic category where you're able to infect people. The symptoms are beginning to build up. So at that point, you will show symptoms. And then you move into the mildly symptomatic or the severely symptomatic or the critically symptomatic phases of these things. So exactly how much time you spend is shown in this picture here. So the asymptomatic people move from exposed to asymptomatic to the recovered compartment fairly fast. The mildly symptomatic people move from the exposed to the pre-symptomatic to the mildly symptomatic to the recovered component. But then there are also people who can fall critically ill. So they move from the severely symptomatic compartment into hospitalized compartment. And from there, they can either die or they can recover. And we all know now the rates at which people move between the different compartments, because that's where the clinical knowledge actually comes in. The model is described in that little figure that you see at the bottom. The SEIR model becomes this much more complicated model with 9 compartments, no longer 4. The susceptible, exposed, pre-symptomatic, asymptomatic, mildly symptomatic, severely symptomatic, hospitalized, dead, recovered. All of these are there in our complicated description. But what we can say is which people who are infected affect those who are susceptible by making them infected as well, by changing something from the outside, which we call a non-pharmaceutical intervention. For example, just by quarantining people, I have reduced the contacts between people. I have not made it, for example, you sitting in Bangalore cannot contact me sitting in Sonepat in Haryana. So because had I been in Bangalore and we were not under lockdown, we could have met, for example, on MG Road, walked past each other. You might have sneezed and I could have picked it up from you. But by quarantining people, we are preventing them from mixing together and making it that much harder for people to transfer the disease from one person to the other. It's the product of the beta that tells you how fast you go from S to E with the C's that determine the reproductive ratio R. And I can think of lockdowns and other types of interventions as really measures that alter the effective reproductive ratio. We started off with states. Now we are going to model every district in India right now. We want to model, in fact, we are currently modeling how it's more difficult for people who are ill, who are older, to recover from the disease. They will most likely have adverse outcomes. We have put in migration. We've also put in healthcare accessibility. In remote districts, where you have to go to the town in order to find a good hospital where you can be tested, that ensures that many people who are symptomatic will not be able to make it, even severely symptomatic, will not be able to make it to hospital. And we include that in our particular models. We can also look at cities and imagine how diseases spread out. Suppose someone who is ill first flies into Bombay, and then the disease spreads in Bombay, and then someone flies to Delhi or Calcutta or somewhere else, and then they're able to distribute that disease. We can look at that, look at the whole network of 300 odd cities, and see how the disease spreads among those cities. That's like putting in migration into the model. So I want to summarize very quickly what information you get from these models. The first information is that whether you start with 10 or 100 or 1,000 cases in the beginning, it doesn't matter. You still see the epidemic go up and come down. The number of infected, as I pointed out, goes to a maximum and then comes down. The point is, what is that maximum value? And how do you control that maximum value? Obviously, if you have a order, let us say, everybody, half the people in the state getting sick, you will easily run out of hospital beds. You will easily run out of ICU units. You will easily run out of ventilators. All of the things that you need in order to ensure that people can survive the disease. What you want to do is to be able to ensure that the total number of infections never really crosses a boundary that you can set, which is determined by the maximum capacity of your healthcare system. So one thing is that the number of cases that you have in the beginning doesn't really matter to that number. All it does is shift the peak slightly. If you change the infectivity, the rate at which the reproductive ratio of the disease, that corresponds to lowering the peak of that curve as well as shifting it out. And that's really the aim of every non-pharmaceutical intervention that you might want to try on. You want to reduce the number of cases, reduce the peak of the number of cases, and you want to ensure that you don't have too many patients coming in at any time. You want to spread those numbers of patients out. This is called flattening the curve, and this is a term that some of you may have heard earlier. We then looked at the effects of testing and quarantining people. What happens if you are able to test more and more people in the population? And the moment you find out someone is ill, you immediately ensure for them to be taken out of the population, either quarantined separately or very rigorously quarantined at home. And that's one very effective way of pushing the height of that peak down and spreading it out over a much longer time. What happens with lockdowns? And the answer is that with a lockdown, with just a simple lockdown, all you do is to delay the peak. Once the moment the lockdown is over, even if there's 1 or 2 cases left at that end, you will start off the peak again. The only way to really use a lockdown constructively is to continue to test and to test and quarantine during the lockdown as well as after that. If you do that, if you combine quarantines with lockdown and testing, then you can suppress the curve, you can flatten the curve, and ensure finally that there are not that many patients who have to come in and stress your public health system. So the faster you can test and quarantine, the faster you can ramp it up to testing a large number of your population, the better it is. The last thing that we looked at was measures to send people back to work. Many of you have now been away from college, you've been confined, quarantined at home, and must be asking this question: what happens next? How do governments deal with this particular question? So one thing is to allow everybody to go back to work, but then given that there are still cases, that doesn't seem a particularly good thing to do, because this is a disease that is an infectious disease. It can spread fast through a particular population, and the maximum value of people infected at the peak of that disease can be very large if you don't take appropriate measures. And the lockdown was one such measure. What we suggest is that one way of doing this is to divide the population into 3 parts. 1/3 of the population goes to work for 2 days a week, and then goes back home for 4 days, and they're effectively under lockdown for those 4 days. The second third goes for the next 2 days, and then they come back and are under lockdown for 4 days. The third of that third goes on the following 2 days after that. So that days 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So they're there on day 5 and 6, and they come back and they're quarantined for the next 4 days. This ensures that everybody goes back to work. And for students, you might want to go for 2 days of physical classes and then come back and do classes at home for 4 days. So that's some mix of being both getting the experience of a college or a university, as well as coming back and keeping people safe. In order to do this effectively, you must ensure that the lockdown at home is very effective. You must ensure that people who are having symptoms of the sickness are pulled out of the population quarantine, and their family is also tested, even though they may not be symptomatic. You must continue to do this through this period in order to be able to stamp the disease out. But this is one way in which you can send people back to work. This is called a periodic asynchronous lockdown. It's a technical term that we devised for it. Let me finish up with some other approaches, and let me tell you about one approach which is called an agent-based model. An agent-based model is a way of thinking about epidemiology by thinking about an entire city that you model on a computer. So imagine that for every person in the city, for about, let's say, Bangalore population of somewhere like between 7 and 8 million people, you have one entity defined on a computer, and you put just enough of information into that computer, that synthetic entity or that computational entity that describes where they stay, where they work, how they move back and forth, how they interact with other people, how children go to school, and all of these other. So what you need is information that you can feed into the properties of what I call agents. These computational creatures are called agents. And what you need is a synthetic population that describes the city that you're interested in at the level of detail that you're interested in. There's a very nice model that has come out of IISc Bangalore and TIFR Bombay, mainly IISc Bangalore, who's been looking at Bangalore city, and that's a picture of their results. And they've been looking at controlling the number of people who go to workspaces, controlling the number of people who stay at home under lockdown situations, relaxing things in various ways to ask, how does that influence disease spread? We have been working on a similar model, although we want to look at an India-wide model. We want at some point to be able to simulate 1.3 billion people on a computer and ask similar questions about diseases and how they spread on the computer. Here's one example of what we do. I hope you can see this particular movie. So here we can show exactly as an agent-based model, a synthetic city with people moving back and forth between different parts of the city. So in here, you can imagine that someone falls ill, then they communicate the disease to somebody else. That disease, the number of infected builds up. You can see that in the picture that you see in the bottom right-hand corner of the disease beginning to build up and the number of infected gradually increasing as people move around, circulate, give one person who's ill, gives another person who is susceptible, gives them the disease. There's a lot of information that we gather from this. For example, that a lockdown, even if you sort of soften the lockdown in some ways, that really doesn't help in curtailing the disease spread. If you allow the children to run around and play outside and transfer the infection from one to the other, even though they're just on the same street, that infection, the chances that infection spreading becomes so much larger. And the more you allow people to work, mix together, you relax this stringent condition of the lockdown, the easier it is for the epidemic to be out of control. Let me finish up by describing here for you this question of what happens next. Okay? And that's an important question. So right now, if we thought of the usual epidemic curve, we would have a curve that had a doubling time of somewhere between 4 and 7 days. And that would go up and that would come down. And at the peak of that epidemic, you would have a very large number of people being actually infected. Okay. What we've accomplished with the lockdown, with physical distancing between people, just ensuring that they're not too much in contact together, is to be able to flatten that curve. We've done this by a combination of the lockdown, of distancing measures, of closing down malls and cinemas and places where people tend to gather. That's called the flattening of the curve. The problem with this is that if you lift the flattening of the curve, you risk that number increasing, again becoming larger. So that's a fact that all epidemiologists know, that you do have to maintain these restrictions for some amount of time. If you look at the experience of other countries with this, look at the top lines, Australia, Austria, Cambodia, China, Croatia, you can see the number rise and come down. So that's the number of new cases of COVID-19. So ideally, you would like to be in the situation of one of these countries, whereas you go forward in time, so the end of that graph is sometime in the end of April, early May. By then, the number of new cases per day is actually beginning to decline. If you look at Turkey, that's a situation where the number of cases went up, began to decline, but still has not made it to a small number yet. And now, again, it seems to be threatening to rise again. Compare that to India. We are seeing a gradual increase, but we still haven't seen the peaking. We haven't seen the coming down yet. And that's interesting because then we have to reevaluate what it is. Where do we stand with respect to the disease? Is it too early to lift the stringent lockdown, the stringent measures that we had earlier? We now have to really be very careful about what we do to in terms of mitigating the consequences. It is true that people have to get back to work, but the price of sending people back to work, if it is that inevitably that 1 to 2% of the population might die as a consequence of getting the infection, that is a very, very high price to pay. That is something that really has to be sorted out in terms of public policy, government policy, of restrictions in some way that we must begin to impose on people. And as I said, life will not go back to normal in a hurry. It will not be completely normal by tomorrow or after May 17th or after May 20th. We'll all have to prepare for a long period in which you'll have to control your social behavior, get used to not going out so much, avoiding large groups, washing your hands, sanitizing, wearing masks as much as possible, submitting to a COVID-19 test, even if you remotely suspect that you might have the disease, making sure those around you in the community are also reporting they have the disease. This is the only way to protect those around you. It's not just yourself. You're not just concerned about you as a person with the disease, but people you may associate with, your grandparents who are at home, who may be elderly, other people, colleagues around you who may have diabetes or cardiovascular conditions, people you may meet, your teachers, your students, all of whom, for various reasons, might be more or less susceptible to the disease. So the point is that you will really have, all of us will have to figure out what is the new normal in this case. It's clear that this will not be the old normal, what we have been used to earlier, but our lives have changed in a fundamental way. And it will certainly be at least a year or 2 years till a vaccine is discovered before we can go back to any semblance of normalcy. So let me finish with that. Let me thank the Indian Academy for, I'm very grateful for this invitation to come and speak to you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have about COVID-19, the epidemiology of COVID-19. Thank you for your patience in listening to me.
Sir, thanks a lot, sir. It was really a very illuminating session for all of us because we had several doubts, several things were unclear to us, and some of the things what you mentioned was really, really illuminating to all of us. So I hope all of us agree to this, and it was really a great session for all of us. So thanks a lot, sir, once again.
Yeah.
And so I would like active questions from the participants. So the participants can either type their questions in the chat provided in the WebEx app, the Cisco WebEx app, or those who are accessing the webinar through Facebook. So please type it in your the comment section of the Facebook live webinar page. So I actively encourage the participants to ask questions. Sir, Gautam sir, regarding the quarantine, you mentioned that we have to slowly come with this asynchronized method of periodic asynchronized lockdown. What to say, that particular path. So right now, the government of Karnataka and even the central government has slowly started to think of coming out of the lockdown. Okay, so what would you recommend? Is this the right thing? What is happening, or anything else to be taken?
It is a hard decision, and this is, every government is dealing with this very difficult decision. It is
Okay.
difficult for ordinary people to stay away from work, not just in all of us
Yes,
in
sir.
various ways, but certainly people who work in sort of in the non-formal industries, in the formal sector, is 70 to 80% of them. The agricultural sectors, which all of us, our food relies on people going and the farmers in
Yes.
this country.
Yes, yes.
So it is a very hard choice. Certainly, some jobs people can go back because they involve less physical contact between people.
Okay.
But areas that are dense concentrations of people are that we really have to control. For example, stagger the hours in which you might go to market, or which, for example, that retailers might go to the wholesale market. That this should not happen throughout the day. There should be some schedule that is put in. People in malls and cinemas, I think cinemas will just have to become used to not having every seat full, but 1/3 seat full. You might have to pay more. So all of these are very different and difficult for us to accept that these will have to do this. But I think what we understand from the disease and the way it has struck many countries outside India, and even with India, the fear is that we don't really have a good enough handle on the number of people actually dying or actually infected by it, because our system of keeping records of these is not very good. Does not of the quality that, for example, of the typical Scandinavian countries, or where everyone who's died is kept very careful track of. So this is a difficult choice for governments to make, and I think the asynchronous lockdown is one solution, but we'll have to see what other solutions there might be.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Sir, there is one question. One person has asked, eating cross species, as in the case of non-vegetarian eaters, how effectively the infectious diseases arises and spreads in the case of the non-vegetarians? Does it have?
No, it doesn't matter at all. I mean, that's fairly clearly understood. Viruses are killed by eating anyway, and there's no way you can get it from chicken or meat or anything. So that you should not worry about.
We should never take into consideration.
Okay. You should, yeah.
Okay, so there's one from Dr. Chakradhar. So there are too many assumptions in making the SEIR HQF model. So mostly from USA, Europe data. Do we, like in India, specific data for all the 9 parameters of the complicated models?
Very good question. And the answer is that at least from what we know, there is not enough. What we're really looking out for is enough Indian data on Indian patients, which you need line lists of patients, when they came into hospital, what symptoms they had, when they were discharged, did they go to ICU, and so on. Currently, there is no real reason to believe that the way Indians fall ill and the way Italians or US people fall ill is any different. For example, there are lots of examples of Indian nurses in the UK who have fallen ill with COVID-19. Their symptoms seem to be pretty much the same, and their trajectory through the disease seems to be pretty much the same as anyone in the UK actually catching the disease. In fact, there's a little worry that people who have come from ethnic Asian backgrounds might be more susceptible to the disease. And it's not very clear whether the larger fraction of them are people in the healthcare industry and therefore more in contact with patients, or whether there is something genetic. As far as we know, there is no reason to believe that the way the disease plays out in a non-Indian population, for example, Singaporean population or the Chinese or Italian or the UK or the US, is really significantly different. If obviously we can, once we have enough of a corpus of Indian data, we can answer this much more specifically, which we don't have at the moment.
So the immune system too just plays a role, because the immune system of different races they respond differently to the COVID-19.
In principle, that's true, but remember that this is a virus that nobody's immune system has seen. This is a novel coronavirus, so everybody's in the same boat. We have no pre-existing immunity to this particular virus as far as.
Okay, thanks, sir. So there is one question from a student, Amlan Hussain. There have been cases where recovered patients get a second infection. So the question is, why is this factor not taken in the compartment model?
Very good question. Yeah.
And the second one, sir, sorry. If recovered patients get an infection once again, how does it affect the statistics?
Okay, very good question. And as far as what is understood nowadays is that the patients who come in again and diagnosed positive are diagnosed positive because the test is very accurate. The PCR test is very accurate, and it picks up even pieces of dead RNA inside your bloodstream. So these are people who are testing positive. It's not clear that they are testing positive for this because they are infectious with the disease or have been infected with the disease. It's possible that their immune system has been affected through the first bout of disease. And that is why they're coming back with something else that might be related. But the fact that they have tested positive again doesn't mean that they have COVID-19 again. Okay. That's what I wanted to stress.
So that's a very good point what you mentioned. Yes, sir. Thank you. And one more question from Suniti Hegde. So some regions do not have any cases of COVID-19, but suddenly they have more than 50 to 20 cases. So how do we really deal about that?
Some say, what is the first part?
Some regions, like they have not any cases of COVID-19, but suddenly they have about 15 to 20 cases. So how do we really deal this?
Again, a very beautiful question. The problem is with testing, because often testing is very inhomogeneous across regions. So we don't know whether the reason a region is not detecting cases is because it just was not testing enough. Suddenly a batch of tests was sent to that area, then they began to test and they found a lot of. So exactly understanding whether how much of this is because of some feature of the disease versus some feature of how you test for the disease, or your ability to test, or the limitations in the number of tests that you have, or even problems with the test, which probably is less of an issue, but certainly how you extract samples for the test is certainly a significant issue, and that needs some amount of medical training, the ability to extract samples from the back of your throat. Very good question.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So one more person, Yashwant Kumar, he's asking, what are the chances of COVID-19 mutating in the current situation? We have been reading about this. So it's been changing a lot. If there is a mutation, so will it be harmful than now? So what is the knowledge available about this?
Again, a great question. So all viruses mutate, all bacteria mutate. So so COVID-19 is so SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA virus, so it's expected to mutate a little more than ordinary DNA viruses. It is not mutating very fast, so that's at least one positive. Mutations could go either way. They could either become more sort of harder more injurious to humankind, or it could be less. So right now we have absolutely no idea. It doesn't seem as though there's a difference in virulence in different strains of SARS-CoV-2, although that has been raised, that maybe the strain in Gujarat is different from the strain in Karnataka or Kerala or something like that. But right now there seems to be no reason for belief that that is true, that there are much more virulent, much less virulent strains going around. Although it is certainly true that the virus will continue to mutate. And the hope is that it does not mutate into something. It is much more virulent.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely no idea.
Okay. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir, yeah, thanks a lot. And there's one more question from Dr. Chakra there. So he's telling the spike mutations in the virus. So is our creating of serology test still valid for this? Hello?
As far as we know, the serology tests are still okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes,
the serology tests are still okay, even though some of them target the spike protein. We have not heard of any failures of the tests, of the serology tests so far that are connected with mutations in the spike protein. Although I'm not an expert in this is my understanding.
Okay.
Professor Menon, about differentiating the co-infections itself.
Yeah.
In rural areas, I've been told that even in the past, before COVID, it was hard to detect whether it was dengue, or now if you have dengue and COVID, whether the healthcare workers are able to distinguish them, I feel it's a challenge right now.
It will be a huge challenge, and that is certainly an extremely important part of being able to diagnose, because you don't want to misdiagnose. Both are can have deadly consequences, and they have fairly similar, as you pointed out. I mean, body pain, fever, etc. All of these are fairly
Sure.
similar between these diseases. So you're absolutely right. This is very crucial. It will become more important as we go into the rainy season, and that certainly is a worry.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Sir, there is one Dr. Chakra there. His another question is differentiating co-infections. Is a challenge?
I think he just asked that question. I think.
Yes.
Already answered.
Differentiating co-infections, it is a challenge.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
what do you say about this, sir?
No, he just asked that question. I just responded.
Oh, you responded.
Very good
Okay.
question. It is a problem to.
Yeah.
It is really a genuine problem for our public health system.
Yes, thank you, sir. And there's one more question by a student. Is plasma therapy, is it really successful in the compelling situation right now? So as no proof has been given till now regarding this treatment, some people have already tried this. Even in India, they've started trying the plasma therapy.
Yeah. I don't know. It's sort of certainly reasonable that antibodies that you extract from plasma should have some sort of effect in helping you disease, but I don't know whether there is a final word on that saying that this is the way to proceed. I'm not able to. I don't have enough knowledge of that particular area. I think it's very active at the moment.
Okay. And Dr. Ponguday has one question. Is COVID-19 about the spike mutations? So you already mentioned about the mutations. She has mentioned about spike mutation. Ma'am, you could be clear about this. Your question, ma'am. Hello, hello, hello. Ma'am, are you able to hear me? Yes. Okay. So in the our faculty member Bhargavi ma'am has one question. Below what R0 value is it safe to lift the lockdown restrictions, sir?
The aim is always to get R0 down below 1. Because an R0 below 1 is a disease that is not spreading anymore. Any R0 above 1 is a disease that is spreading to the population. The further away it is from 1, the faster it spreads and the larger number of people want to infect it. So right now, R0 is still greater than 1. It's about 1.2 all India, although local regions can be very different. Maharashtra can be different from Karnataka, from Kerala, from other parts. So talking about India is just in terms of just one number is not a very useful piece of information. You have to talk about it really at the micro level of even of different districts and different towns to see how the disease is spreading. Ideally, you want to push it down below 1. That's really the target. But we could be happy enough with having it small enough of 1.1, 1.2, etc., because that still signals that you're controlling it. You're having people who are continuing to be infected, but it's never going to swamp your healthcare systems. People are going to come to hospital. There will be hospital beds. There'll be ventilators. There'll be ICU units. So as long as you satisfy that condition, it's okay. And with 1.1, 1.2, certainly you're there in the right ballpark area.
Okay. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. The participants, you're encouraged to ask one or two more questions before we end the session. You can mention it. Yeah. So, Dr. Chakradhar has asked one more question. So, could you please explain prevalence rates and the heterogeneity associated about them?
So, prevalence just measures the number of people infected at any particular time in the whole population. So, the SIR model, all the models that I told you, will give you an idea of what the prevalence is in terms of the number of infected at that point. It actually measures, those quantities do measure the prevalence of the disease. The heterogeneity could be because the reproductive ratio, R0, is different in different parts. For example, that has to do a lot with many things. It has to do with the disease, with how the disease spreads. So it's purely biological factors. It also has to do with social factors. In which regions is distancing more effective? In which is it less effective? The more effective hand washing, making sure your hands don't touch your face, wearing masks, distancing of every sort, the more you have those, the lower your R0. So it's completely possible for Chennai and Bangalore and Bombay and Delhi and and Bidar and Mysuru all to have different values of R, because they implement the seriousness with which they implement these non-pharmaceutical interventions is different. All of these determine the different values of R across these regions, and all of these together determine the heterogeneity of the number of people who are infected, the prevalence of the disease. Great question.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. The students are encouraged to ask a few more questions before we end the session. Yes, students, if you could please ask a few more questions. And even the other participants are encouraged to ask a few more questions. Yes. So in the absence of further questions, I would now request our beloved principal sir to give the concluding remarks before I deliver the vote of thanks. Principal sir, Dr. Jerome Xavier sir, will you please give your concluding remarks on the session? Sir, hello. Hello, Jerome sir.
Yeah, Dr. Prashanti, she said she would like to say a few words. So
Yes, yes, sir.
you requested to do that. Yes, it will
Yes,
be nice.
So Dr. Prashanti ma'am, could you please providing concluding remarks for the webinar? And I really thank you, ma'am, for really having organized this for all of us today. It was your brainchild organizing this webinar. It's really very, very informative for the entire all the participants. So, ma'am, if you could please uh, give the concluding remarks. I think, sir, Prashanti ma'am is actually she's not part of this.
Sir, good evening, sir. So Prashanti ma'am is on Facebook Live, sir. So Anand sir will be proceeding, sir.
Okay.
I'll give the vote of thanks. Before that, sir, if you could
Yeah,
please. Yes.
yes. Professor Gautam, it was so nice of you to be, down to earth and in a very simple and lucid manner you were able to, put across with such a lot of data that you had. I know the statistical analysis that you have, I think, prepared was very good, in depth, and I am sure, particularly the teachers and the research students or scholars, would have been benefited from your talk. Thank you once again. We are always grateful to you.
Thank
You
you,
are
Professor
welcome to
Xavier.
our institution when you come
Thank
to
you so
Bangalore.
much. Thank you for your invitation.
Yeah.
So, thank you, sir. Yes, I would like to now deliver the vote of thanks. First, I would like to address all of you, respected principal sir, Dr. Jerome Xavier sir, Professor Gautam Menon, and all the participants, faculty participants, and the student participants. So, I thank all of you for being part of this today's webinar. So, it has been a great pleasure to host this webinar on COVID-19, understanding its epidemiology, that turned out to be a very grand success. I myself, Dr. Anand Krishna, faculty of the Department of Biochemistry, I would like to propose the following vote of thanks. First of all, I would like to thank the Department of Biotechnology, Government of India, under the DBT Star College program for the financial support to conduct this webinar event. I would like to specially thank Professor Gautam Menon, today's webinar speaker. Professor Gautam very clearly explained about the COVID pandemic in a very, very simple manner. The entire complexity, because all of us know that epidemiology is not a subject which everybody can comprehend. So you made the subject in a nutshell, which everybody can digest it very easily and really appreciate the subject very well, because all of us are really worried about this pandemic. When will we get back to work? When will the students be able to come to college? Because most of them, they just want to come. They're like in every online classes, when will the college start? When will we do our practicals? When will we do our projects? So all of us are keen to get back to work. So, and some of the explanations I've noted down was really very interesting. First, you explained about the source of the COVID pandemic, how its transmission occurred, about the history. That you gave a very elaborate information about the historical aspect of COVID-19, and some of the aspects what you mentioned was the core fatality rate and how it's of importance to India, the Indian pandemic situation, and the test per million which have been conducted right now, and how it is really crucial. And the SIR model was one of the most powerful models. The SIR and the SEIR model is really powerful for us to understand how the epidemiology occurs, and the serial intervals, whatever you mentioned, for how long it takes time for to get infected from the primary source to the secondary source. And one of the best, the take-home message, what I can call from this entire webinar is your information about the INDSCI-SIM model, so which is available. All of you, all the participants can access, as Professor Gautam mentioned, INDSCI SCI.cov.in. So this website, it provides the information about the COVID pandemic, yes, the precautionary measures to be taken, how the disease spreads, okay, the entire scientific basis behind the COVID-19 pandemic can be accessed in all the different languages, as Professor Gautam mentioned. So I encourage all of you to kindly visit this website, okay. Even I'll do the first thing after the webinar is to visit this webpage and learn more about it. So this was one of the best take-home messages from this webinar. And sir, you mentioned one more thing about the agent-based models. That has really been so interesting. So it is something like you simulate, just like how we have in bioinformatics. We're going to simulate the entire biological biochemical process in silico. So in the same way, this agent-based models, it will help us to understand how a disease spreads in a given population. So we have the statistics of the entire population in Bangalore or the entire Karnataka state or the Indian nation. So how it spreads. So this is one of the best models. I feel every government institution has to look at this agent-based models to help us to lift the lockdown as soon as possible. It is something like a catch-22 situation. If we release the lockdown, the pandemic spreads. But how long will we remain in lockdown? So that is something really amazing what you mentioned. And the other main thing what you mentioned as already part of the questions about the periodic asynchronous lockdown. So that was really very, very informative, sir. I hope this is seriously considered by the government and helps us to effectively come out of the lockdown. We need to come out of the lockdown, but as you mentioned, sir, it should be very effective. And our college in this direction, Dr. Jerome sir, has been taking active measures to help us come out of the lockdown and make sure that we resume our what to say educational activities as soon as possible. Principal sir has really been very effective in helping us to come out of this lockdown. Thank you, sir, for this. And so I thank you, Professor Gautam, for having illustrated the necessity of interdisciplinary research to solve this COVID-19 problem. And as from the part of the entire college, the management, the principal sir, and the chairman and the secretary, head of the department, all the faculty members, I would like to thank you, sir, for your really illuminating talk. So I thank all the faculty members. So I would like to specially thank Principal of Indian Academic Degree College Autonomous, Dr. Jerome Xavier, for his constant support and guidance in really making this webinar a great success. The assistance rendered by the management at Indian Academic Degree College is really appreciated. And as an event like this cannot happen, it requires a lot of planning. So we've been fortunate to have a team of motivated and dedicated faculty members of our department under the able leadership of Dr. Prashanti K. Dr. Prashanti has been really instrumental in initiating this webinar and making it a great success. I'm really sad that she's not part of the participant list over here. Otherwise, she would have actively asked a lot of questions and helped illuminate the participants. So it is completely her brainchild, and I thank ma'am for this making this event a grand success. I would like to thank the other faculty members who have been working day and night for the past 2-3 days towards this webinar. Professor Malti, Professor Dilshad Begum, and Professor Pushpa Reddy. And a special note of thanks to Chandan sir, the head of the system admin team of IIDCA, for really helping us arrange this webinar. We had several dry runs and to make sure that the Facebook streaming is quite efficient for all the participants. Thank you, Chandan sir. I would like to thank our CEO sir, Dr. Srinidhi K. Parthasarathy, for his support. I would like to specially thank Mrs. Bharti Ma'am, Secretary of Indian Academy Education Trust, who is the epitome of support for our institution. And I would like to finally thank our Honorable Chairman, Dr. T. Somshekhar, an expert scientist and a vice administrator who has been constantly motivating each and every one of us, each and every faculty and student at Indian Academic Group of Institutions to help us achieve our goals in science. So respected guests, students and faculty participants, I thank all of you cordially on behalf of the Indian Academic Degree College for making this webinar a great success and learning about this. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Principal, sir. Thank you, all faculties and students.
Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you, Gautam, sir. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Chandan, sir, are you able to hear me, sir?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sir, how do I stop the recording? If I exit the meeting, will it automatically get recorded?
No, you need to stop the recording, sir.
So how do I stop the recording? Click the button.
It will be there in the top actually where you have started recording. No, there.
Okay, sir. Stop recording. Okay.